Kia ora koutou. I'm Monique Pearson and I'm the Interim General Manager at the Mind Lab. I've recently started my role here and I'm absolutely thrilled to be on a call today with David Parsons, who's our National Postgraduate Director, and Herbert Thomas, who's our Program Lead for the Masters of Contemporary Education program. And I'm thrilled because we're going to be talking about some interesting programs, some pathways, and some insights around how teachers and educators can come on board and learn some more contemporary education and methodologies with us. So Dave and Herbert, thank you so much for joining me today. I thought I'd start off the session, Dave, with you introducing some of the programs that we currently have at the Mind Lab, and then Herbert will shift over to you to talk about the Master's program.
Yeah, kia ora, Monique, thanks. Yeah, so the two programs that I'm just going to talk briefly about today are our Postgraduate Certificate in Digital and Collaborative Learning, which has been our longest running program, in fact, has been running since 2014. And then a much more recent program, which is our MicroCredential, which has a similar title, and I'll kind of explain the difference as I go along, which is Digital and Collaborative Teaching and Learning. So I'll just start with a very quick overview of the certificate. So the Postgraduate Certificate in Digital and Collaborative Learning is designed for in-service educators, primarily teachers, but we've also had other types of educator on programs, such as museum staff and librarians and consultants and so on. And it's a 60-credit postgraduate certificate program, runs over a period of 35 weeks part-time. And the intention is to help teachers or other educators simply to upskill, to bring in not just the digital tools, or indeed not just the concept of collaborative learning, but really an overview of contemporary educational practice and an opportunity for, if you like, a real in-depth professional development for teachers. And of course, that leads into, as Herbert will explain a little bit later, the Masters. But the other program that I will briefly also introduce is our Digital and Collaborative Teaching and Learning MicroCredential. And the similarity in the titles is deliberate because the MicroCredential is 15 credits. It's the same level as the certificate, level 8 and under NZQA. The intention of micro-credentials, and this is quite a new thing internationally and in New Zealand, so some people may not be too familiar with them, but they're kind of standalone qualifications, but they're at the same level as the more well-known qualifications across the framework that people would already know. And so there is an intention that they are compatible, so we can also touch on that as well. But if I can just explain what's in this particular program. So the delivery method is somewhat different. In the certificate, it's actually a facilitated program. There's regular weekly sessions, and outside of lockdowns, we also have face-to-face blocks that are optional. The micro-credential is delivered in a more self-paced way. So it's not actually facilitated. We don't have weekly sessions where we deliver content. The content is available on an online platform and people can work through at their own pace. We do have some face-to-face online, but it's mainly sort of support sessions rather than content delivery. So it's really more intended for people who want to do something that's more self-managed. It's also less intense as well. So again, it might be easier for some people to fit the micro-credential into their schedules. So we do see them as being somewhat a different option, but they're not entirely separate in the sense that there is an opportunity for teachers to do this micro-credential and later on feed into the postgraduate program. And in fact, there is a pathway that's now possible for them to do 2 micro-credentials, this one, and we also have one leadership beyond sustainability, and then that can feed into the second part of the certificate. So there's a number of different options there that educators can take, depending on how much they want to be facilitated, whether they want to just do a small qualification that's standalone, whether they want a different pathway into the latter part of the certificate, and from that to lead into the Masters. So this is probably a good moment for me to sort of pass on to Herbert to explain how that all fits together.
Essentially, the Master of Contemporary Education is a 180 credit qualification, NZQA level 9. As Dave has pointed out, if you've completed the certificate, the DCL certificate, then in fact you've completed the first 60 credits of the masters. If we look at parts 2 and 3, if we can call them that, those that follow the DCL, then part 2 essentially is geared towards building on the knowledge that you acquire, the skills that you acquire in part 1. And the design of part 2 is such that it works towards the production of a project scope or project plan at the end of part 2. And then in part 3, you actually lead, plan, implement, and evaluate a project in your practice, in your organization. And at the end of that, there's a symposium where you present your findings to your peers and of course to the MC staff members. So the way in which it normally works is there are 2 options available to prospective candidates. The one option is a full-time option, which means that you complete parts 2 and 3 in a year. And the part-time option is based on the idea that you complete parts 2 and 3 in 2 years. So those are the 2 entry sort of options into part 2. Traditionally, what has happened is our candidates have predominantly been drawn from the DCL program. We're in the process of expanding that at the moment, where we're currently working on a pathway from the certificate in leading change for good, which is a postgrad certificate at level 8. That will eventually pathway into the masters as well. We also have the situation where, for example, if prospective candidates have completed a postgrad cert, a relevant one at another institution, organization, they can actually cross-credit much of the work they've done in that postgrad cert into the masters. So there are a range of possible pathways into the masters from various sort of perspectives. In terms of the nature of the masters, I think it's very much self-determined. So we speak about the idea that because it's your masters, essentially you design it, and that's the direction we're going in, where we'd like to offer a far more personalized service to candidates. What I mean by that quite simply is adapting the skills and the content that we offer particular candidates based on their interests in what they'd like to implement in part 3. So the design of part 2 is very much geared towards the individual candidate's interests in part 3. The other aspect, I think, of the masters that's in the past has served candidates really well is the collaborative aspect. And so we're building out this whole idea of a range of options in terms of collaboration. Because the masters is offered predominantly online, and there are only 4 face-to-face sessions per year. Much of the design obviously is based on online interaction, both synchronous and asynchronous, face-to-face and not face-to-face necessarily. And so one of the ways in which we're hoping to expand the collaboration going forward is the use of what we call communities of inquiry. And what that means quite simply is people who are working on topics that are generally quite similar will work together in project groups on a particular topic. And what that enables candidates to do is to build their projects upon those which have gone before. And so it enriches the kind of project you can do, expands the horizon, and ensures really that you're working on sort of cutting edge things. In a nutshell, that's the masters.
That sounds fantastic. And thank you both for that very comprehensive explanation. Dave, just a question about, or really just to recap about what you said. Those micro-credentials, it's quite interesting and relatively new. That's my understanding. And it's a sort of crash course on the future. It's quality learning. It's a compact package. Is this something new to the Mind Lab?
Yes, it is quite recent. I mean, we started our first micro-credentials in 2020. Mm-hmm. We had a couple of level 7 micro-credentials, which have done very well. But what we've been looking at more recently is level 8 micro-credentials. And the reason for that is that we want them to be able to contribute towards the postgraduate pathway. So level 7 is effectively kind of 3rd year of a degree. But what we're hoping is that these level 8 micro-creds can be a little bit more helpful to students in having a different way of approaching their postgraduate study and give them more options. Yeah. So that's what we're trying to do. I mean, if people aren't familiar with a microcred, you can kind of think of it as being like a course within a larger program, except that they become standalone qualifications. So it's very similar, if you like, to maybe, you know, enrolling in a program somewhere and like taking one course and doing that one course. But normally those courses don't sort of count for anything. They aren't in themselves a qualification, but a micro-credential is. So the intention ultimately is that you'd be able to construct your own postgraduate program almost entirely from a set of micro-credentials. And that's certainly not possible now, but it might well be something that people can do in the future as more and more institutions offer these micro-credentials, and you can hopefully be able to sort of assemble them in a way that works for you, and then you can end up with a larger qualification that's actually made up of these microcreds. So it's new, yes, but I think it's something that's going to become increasingly popular and visible to people at large in terms of thinking about their education and how they want to take it forward.
Wonderful. And Herbert, the master's program, I wish I had known about this a couple of years ago myself. I'm really quite fascinated to hear about this practice-based, this really practical approach to the project. Can you explain to me, so someone who's considering the program, the master's program, what are the things that they should take into account when looking at the Masters of Contemporary Education?
I think the practical component that you pointed out is really one of the strengths of the master's program. Now, clearly, there are many master's programs that do have a practical component, but I think what sets us apart to some extent is the idea that we plan to tailor the student experience to individual requirements, not only in the project itself, but also during the course of part 2, where we're actually preparing candidates to enter into that phase. And so if you look at the way in which part 2 is designed and structured, everything in part 2 is designed towards enabling people to actually implement those projects in part 3. So if you think about the usefulness, if you like, of that for people who are in practice at the moment, what your project really ends up being by the very nature of this kind of project is it's very much a change project. And in fact, that's what we call it. We call it a practice-based change project. So, you know, it's not merely a matter of saying, I'm going to implement X in my practice. What you're doing is you, in fact, acting as a change agent in the organization. And so there are a whole range of skills that are associated with that there. For instance, one of the things we look at very carefully in the masters is, you know, the whole idea of leading change and what that looks like, and what are the various leadership approaches and models that tend to work well in those kinds of environments. The recognition of what complexity looks like, because I think everybody's now come to realize that education by definition is complex, according to the sort of classical definition of complexity. So in implementing the project, you're not only gaining the skills associated with the content that you're dealing with, but there are a whole range of associated skills that come with that. Things like, how do you work with different stakeholder groups, where every stakeholder group's requirements are unique in a sense? You know, how do you lead the change as a change agent? How do you actually evaluate the effectiveness of that change? And then also, of course, related to that, the whole issue around how do you engage meaningfully in complex environments, which is probably a set of skills that people don't speak about enough, mainly because there's so many complex issues we face in modern day society. And of course, you know, if we were to sort of take the 10,000-foot view of the project and the masters, one of the things we could say is many of the challenges we face in society nowadays are really, really complex. If you look at something like climate change, for example, and the kinds of skills that not only teachers, but their students, the next generation who actually have to face these challenges, the kinds of skills they demand will be skills, amongst others, that enable them to engage sort of meaningfully in complex environments. So there are a whole range of associated advantages to the project, really.
That's wonderful. And it's heartening to know that what students and educators are learning right now is something that they can take forward, apply immediately, but it also is helping shape their future and the future of their students, their communities, and their families. And it just builds out to Aotearoa, which is wonderful. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, well, what sort of level should I come in? If I'm an educator and I'm thinking, is this program right for me? Where do I start? Do I have 2 years experience, 20 years experience? Dave, what's your advice to those people who are looking to come on board and don't know where to start?
Well, just to pick up that thing about experience, the answer is it doesn't matter. So if you look at our demographic across the DCL over the years we've been running, it's a very broad demographic. So we have a few students who pretty much come in as soon as they've qualified. So they're still in their 20s. And then we have people right through the range, right up to their 60s, even 70s, because as you probably know, teachers in New Zealand, quite often carry on working long past the time when they might have to, because, a lot of them really want to continue to teach. And it's really nice to see people who are, coming in towards what would normally be kind of the end of their careers, kind of rejuvenating their practice and bringing in new ideas. I think the average age across our programs is sort of in the mid-40s. So it's basically for anyone, because the key thing that we always say is that it doesn't matter what you're coming in with, that's where you are now. And our job, I guess, is to help you move from where you are towards where you want to be. It doesn't matter whether, let's say, you come in and you know almost nothing about digital tools and you've never really done any sort of collaborative learning, and you're almost starting from scratch. And of course, if we get students in who've just qualified, they've not really been taught any of this stuff typically, because their initial teacher education is about all the sort of fundamentals of teaching and learning and traditional. Or you might have people coming in, they're already, the sort of the lead educator in their school in digital technologies. But it doesn't really matter, because, we try to help them think about where they are now, where they want to go, and help them make that next move. So the point of being on the program for any individual is simply to develop their own practice in a way that meets the needs that they personally have. So really, there's no restrictions on that.
Yeah, it reminds me of that adage, you can't teach what you don't know. And I think some people, certainly I've experienced this in the past, is that technology, it frightens me. It did in the past, and it might frighten some people. Herbert, what would be your advice to those people who are going, oh, it's all about technology, and yeah, that scares me.
It's actually a very interesting question, because some of our candidates actually arrive at the beginning of the masters, and that's what they're telling us, is that they're really concerned about technology. And I think the kind of discussion we enter into with them right at the beginning is, first of all, it's not all about technology. And so when we speak about contemporary education, there are so many sort of pressing and relevant issues that are contemporary that have absolutely nothing to do with technology. There's, for example, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we speak about the issue of culturally responsive practice. We speak about, in schools, we speak about the disparity in performance, for example, between different cultural groups. And so there's some really pressing issues we need to be dealing with that have absolutely nothing to do with technology. But then what we also do is we offer a course that looks at something called digital fluency, broadly defined. And partially, I think, partially that's about uncovering the truth surrounding technology as a tool. Right? And in the end, that's what technology is. It's one way in which you can enable learning if you use the tool wisely and according to sort of sound pedagogical principles. But the flip side of that is there are also instances where technology can get in the way. And so you want to make people aware of that. So we have that discussion, but the discussion really is also just a springboard, if you like, for a much broader discussion where we speak about the idea that technology is really a form of change. And the issues that people have with technology quite often are really issues that they have with change. And people, as we know, are quite often uncomfortable with change. It makes people uncomfortable. And so, quite often technology, because it appears to be something new in an environment, is associated with or rather all the negative feelings associated with change are generally associated with technology. Whereas we should be looking at technology as partially a change issue and partially a technology issue. So there's a tool side to it in terms of technology, but there's also being able to cope with change and to be able to work with change, really.
And we saw that with COVID going into lockdown, having to pivot really, really quickly and still keep classrooms open, or at least online for that matter, but still keep educating. We didn't stop learning. And I think this is one way where people can see technology really working for us, but it still requires that human element. So it is that beautiful harmony between people, change, and technology. So now I'm thinking about where I might go to find more information if I am interested in a program. I've just listened to this or watched this Zoom session, and where do I go? Where do I find more information, Dave?
Well, I guess the obvious place to go would be the MindLab website, themindlab.com. That has all the information on it relating to the programs. And Lisa, our outreach manager, is also the person, if you want to have a conversation with, you can contact her through the website, or just use her email at lisa@themindlab.com. So yeah, the information, probably website, the place to start. And if you want to have a conversation with someone, Lisa will be very happy to talk to you about any of the programs that we've been talking about today.
And is there anything else, Dave, Herbert, that you'd like to share with any of our listeners, viewers?
I guess, one thing I perhaps would like to say is, what is it that students actually get out of doing these programs? And I think there are a number of things that we see a lot coming through in the feedback that we get. And I think the one that I'd like to stress the most is that often what happens is that it restores teachers' interest and enthusiasm for their profession. But also often they find that their job actually gets easier. And one of the reasons for that is that you talked earlier about, teachers might be a bit sort of afraid of technology in some ways, or feeling unprepared. And one of the things that they can learn to do is let go more, particularly with technology, and enable students to have more agency and to be more independent, and to be okay with the fact that they don't have to know everything, and they can often trust their students to take responsibility for their own learning, in terms of things like learning how to use technologies for, whether it's just finding things out on the internet, or whether it's using digital tools to create something, or whether it's using digital tools to learn collaboratively. Any of these areas, it's okay to let go. And I think, that's hard to do unless there are other people around you sort of helping you to do that. So I think, yeah, ultimately the fact that people come on the program and it's not for the piece of paper. We get people who've already got a master's, for example, coming on the certificate, because it's about the learning, and it's about that reinvigorating their engagement with their own practice. So I think that's what I'd like to share.
Herbert, lots of nodding going on there. Anything you'd like to share?
Well, just endorse what Dave is saying. I think it's very difficult to explain what they get out of this, but what I might do is just refer to two examples which sort of captures it for me. So there's one example of a student who, when she entered into the program, was really, really tentative and very nervous and quite averse to interacting in the online environment, or even worse, of course, being up on a stage and being able to present and so forth. But what was absolutely fascinating was attending her final presentation at the symposium. She stood up there, explained how she'd pretty much changed the culture of her school. And at the end of it, she said, and I've now suddenly realized I'm a visionary leader. And you could actually hear a pin drop in the audience. So it's that kind of, that's, I think, something that captures the essence of what they get out of it. The other example is a fantastic one, where we had two students who were new. They were new entrants, if you like, into teaching, right? So they started at the same school at the same time, and about a month or two into the program, they sort of said, can they speak to me just for 5 minutes? And I said, that'd be great. We had a chat. It turns out that they were becoming quite worried about the school strategic plan, because the strategic plan had been suggesting that they implement 3 or 4 or 5 technological changes over the course of a year, fairly big ones. And they'd realized from what we'd been saying that this looked like a tall order. And so their question was, you know, we first year teachers, what can we possibly do about a school strategy? And we had a bit of a chat about it and so forth. And they came up with an idea. And probably about a month and a half later, 2 months later, they arrived again at a face-to-face session beaming. And I asked them how did it go. And they said, well, what they'd done was they'd actually approached their direct manager, won the manager over. The manager had spoken to the board. The board had seen the folly of their ways, and so they had now been instrumental in bringing about a completely new strategic plan for the school. So I think one of the things that people learn very much in both the DCL and in the MCE is that they have agency. They can make massive changes. It's a matter of just having the tools, having the knowledge, believing in yourself, and yeah, I think that's really powerful.
It is very empowering indeed. Thank you both very much. This has been such a comprehensive and insightful session. I've certainly learned a lot more about the 3 programs. I feel that just knowing this, understanding the suite of NZQA accredited postgraduate teacher programs is something that I can share comfortably with others. If people are interested and want to know more, we have the Mind Lab website. Of course, we have our wonderful outreach manager, Lisa, and of course, myself or Dave Herbert. We're all on the website and people can get in touch with us via email. So unless there's anything else further you'd like to add, I feel very comfortable that I have a well-rounded explanation of the postgraduate programs. Thank you very much.
You're Monique.